I keep breaking the connection. They had committed crimes and they were sentenced. They were given the option. So you either I don't think they were given the options. They were just sentenced to go to the so-called New World to the Europeans. My ancestors have been here for 16, 17,000 years. My Native American ones. So they were given the options to come to the American continent and work for 4 to 7 years. And at the end of those 4 to 7 years, working for plantation owners or industrial people, they would be given a piece of land and they would be freed to pursue work wherever they wanted to do. Now they did this also to Africans that they African people that they kidnapped. So when they kidnapped them in Africa, they baptized them and they said they were Christians. So so that they would be considered Christian. And this was the case with Antonio Johnson. So the right wing says, oh, this was the first slave owner, Anthony Johnson. That's not true. The first about 17, I think there were 17 or 19 enslaved Africans or kidnapped Africans were, I think it were 19. They were brought to the colonies, to the English colonies in the Americas in 1619. Now, it was an English ship, attacked a Portuguese ship, and they kidnapped Africans from them, and they took them to the Americas. Now, a lot of these people, it started as indentured servitude. Even African people who have been kidnapped and brought to the Americas and forced to work for 4 to 7 years. That was the case with Anthony Johnson. When he finished his indentured servitude, he was allowed. He was considered a Christian, and because he had been baptized, and he was given his freedom, and he had the right to have property. And he went into business as a plantation owner, and he bought enslaved Africans. Now, it turned eventually into how did what's called now chattel slavery evolve. Chattel is a possession. So chattel slavery came in the Americas to be after a period of degrading of the human rights of enslaved Africans and enslaved Africans only, and Native Americans by different cases. There was a case, I believe her name. Oh, this guy Anthony Johnson. One of the guys he had working for him as an indentured servant, his name was John Punch. It was an African guy. He had a neighbor, last name Parker, in Virginia, who was a plantation owner too, and he wanted, and the neighbor noticed that Anthony had this guy for way past the period that he was allowed by law to keep him in indentured servitude. So he said, hey, you can't do that, because if you do that, you can lose your rights as a free man. So Anthony Johnson, he took him to court. Anthony Johnson reluctantly freed the guy named John Punch. Now, John Punch went to work for the Parker guy in Virginia, the plantation owner. He didn't go to work paying. He went to indentured servitude, meaning 4 to 7 years more of working for free. And then he was supposed to, hey, Johnny, he was supposed to work for 4 to 7 years and then be given a piece of land to work. Now, Anthony Johnson, an asshole that he was, I don't give a shit what color he was, he went to court and appealed the sentence. And this was the first case in the United States or the colonies back then where he won the appeal, and the court forced indenture for life on John Punch. Basically, he made him work for the court in Virginia because he was an African, and enslaved African, made him work for the rest of his life for Anthony Johnson. And so Parker had to give back John Punch to Anthony Johnson. After that, There was another case called for the lady. There was a black lady. Um, she was the daughter of a English person and an African woman. She went to court, and her name was Elizabeth Key, and her father was an Englishman. Her mother was an African. Now she went to court and said, "Hey, my father, I'm a baptized Christian. My father was a baptized Christian, so um, I can't, you can't hold me a slave. I want my freedom for me and my child." So the attorney for her was an Englishman who was also the father of her child, and she won. She was freed, and declared to be a regular citizen. Shortly after that, the courts in Virginia instituted a law called partum. They call it partum. If you were born of a slave, of an enslaved mother, you were a slave. It didn't matter if your father was European. It didn't matter. This did two things. It enslaved the children. This was another step towards chattel slavery, which is the slavery of you're forever. You're the possession. You're like a machine. You're just a machinery. You're just a pair of shoes, a tool of the owner, property of the owner. That's what chattel slavery is. And your children too. When you have children, your children are going to be property, enslaved, and they can be sold. You could just grab the children out of the right there when the woman gives birth and sell the baby, and which is what they did constantly all the time. So so later on, after Elizabeth Key's case, the courts decided in Virginia they instituted a law, the partum law, that if you were born of an enslaved mother, it didn't matter who the father was. And the father didn't have to take care of you. You were just a possession. You were just furniture for the owner of the plantation or the business or whatever, whoever had the owned you. So then in 1705, they have more laws. I think the Virginia slave codes. I'm not sure. I was just reading about it. Bear with me. And it said that anybody that was from another nation, that nation was non-Christian, and that person was imported, kidnapped, and brought to the United States. That's a term that should use. That person did not have any rights, was considered to be a slave. They called them. They had a term for them, for people, mainly Africans. That law said, I think it was 1705, applied to Native Americans that were kidnapped in battle. If there was a tribe that where the English had come to one of the warring tribes and said, "Hey, sell me your enemies. I'll give you money if you let me, grab the enemies, grab your Native American enemies, sell, and I'll buy them off of you." Since they were already at war, so they took advantage of the conflict and they enslaved the captives and from the battle. So those people were considered slaves also. So Native American people, people from another faith, people from any other country, as long as they were Europeans. So Europeans were not enslaved. So anybody who tries to tell you that, oh, my Irish, they were here as slaves, they were not slaves. They had a contract. Most of them, a lot of them were. A lot of them, not most, a lot of them were convicted of something and they were sentenced to work 4 to 7 years. And that's what's called indentured servitude. And that's 4 or 7 years, they got a piece of land and they got the freedom. They got to go on with their lives. So their children did not get raped, enslaved, and all that shit like the African children did. The children of the African enslaved. So so that fallacy that I mean, it's fascinating to see the atrocities that fascinating is I don't want to use that word. It doesn't fascinate me. It nauseates me. It really is. I'll take that back. It's nauseating to see the what European Christians the horrors that they have committed against other people. So anybody who comes to you and say, "Oh, you know, the first person who bring African slaves to sell them was a black person," first of all, that was a lie. And even if that had been true, what the hell does that have to do? You have to have a broker. You have to work somebody local to exploit their weaknesses. So what the Europeans did, they went. The Portuguese were the most prolific slave traders. My Portuguese ancestors, I have Portuguese ancestry, and Spanish too, and African American, and African, actually African and Native American. I have them all. And they went. They saw the conflicts. They went in with. They started kidnapping people, and when they saw there were conflict, they say, "Hey, I know you have war with this tribe. How about you go capture them? I buy them from you." So they exploited that. So they want to blame the guy that they corrupted with money in that village in Africa for slavery. That ain't going to work. So educate yourself as much as you can.